I never imagined that a simple act of revenge would completely change who I am. Standing there in my marble foyer, watching my 15th housekeeper in 6 months scramble to collect her belongings while tears streamed down her weathered face. I felt nothing but pure rage. The sound of her sobs echoed through the cavernous entrance hall of my Beverly Hills mansion, mixing with the distant laughter and clinking champagne glasses from the charity gala happening in my backyard. $3,000. That's what the baccarat crystal glass she'd shattered was worth. To her, it was probably 3 months' rent. To me, it was the final straw. "Get out," I shouted, my voice bouncing off the Italian marble walls like thunder. And don't think about asking for a reference. Maria Gonzalez, that was her name, though. I'd barely bothered to learn it, clutched her worn leather purse against her chest, and hurried toward the massive oak doors. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the handle, and for a split second, I saw something in her eyes that should have made me pause. Fear, yes, but also disappointment, like she'd expected better from me. That look irritated me more than the broken glass ever could. You know what it's like to be so angry that your vision literally turns red. That's exactly what I was feeling as those doors slammed shut behind her. My reflection stared back at me from the polished marble floor, all 6 feet 3 inches of what people called perfection. Dark hair that looked like it belonged in a Renaissance painting, Mediterranean features that had graced the covers of business magazines, and a body that personal trainers charged thousands to help other men achieve. Greek god, they called me, Alexandros Dimitriou Castellanos, heir to a casino and entertainment empire worth $400 million. But standing there in my $15 million mansion, surrounded by priceless art and crystal that cost more than most people's cars, I felt anything but godlike. I felt empty, furious, and completely, utterly alone. Have you ever felt so isolated that even your own echo sounds foreign? That's been my reality for the past 3 years, ever since my parents died in that helicopter crash in Monaco. Mum and Dad had built this empire from nothing. My grandfather came to America from Crete with nothing but $23 and a dream. By the time I inherited everything at 25, I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but nobody who actually gave a damn about me as a person. The sound of someone clearing their throat behind me snapped me back to reality. I turned to see Marcus Antonio Delacroix, my best friend and business partner, standing in the doorway that led to the party. His French accent always became more pronounced when he was uncomfortable. "Mon Dieu, Alex, was that really necessary?" Marcus asked, adjusting his perfectly tailored Armani tuxedo. The poor woman looked terrified. She broke a $3,000 glass. "Marcus," I replied, straightening my own Tom Ford jacket. "That's more than she makes in a month. Maybe now she learned to be more careful." Marcus shook his head, those knowing blue eyes of his filled with something that looked dangerously close to pity. "You know, my friend, your parents would be ashamed of the man you've become." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus was the only person on earth who could talk to me like that and get away with it. We'd known each other since prep school, and he'd been there through everything: the business successes, the failed relationships, the grief after my parents' death. He was also the only person who remembered what I used to be like before money and loss turned me into this. "Don't," I warned, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare bring them into this." "Someone has to," Marcus continued, seemingly unbothered by my tone. "Because the Alex I grew up with wouldn't have humiliated a working mother in front of a house full of Beverly Hills elite. that Alex had a heart. Before I could respond, the click of designer heels on marble announced the arrival of Cassandra Philippa Rothschild, my ex-fiancée and current headache. She glided toward us in a dress that probably costs more than most people's cars. Her platinum blonde hair perfectly arranged and her surgically enhanced features set in that expression of calculated concern she'd perfected. "Darling," she purred, placing a manicured hand on my arm, "everyone's talking about the little scene you just made. Very dramatic, even for you." The scent of her Chanel No. 5 perfume, a fragrance that once made my heart race, but now just reminded me of everything fake in my life, filled the space between us. Cassandra and I had been engaged for 8 months. Before I realized she was more interested in my bank account than she was in me. The breakup had been messy, public, and expensive. Yet here she was at my party, because in our social circle, you couldn't escape each other even if you wanted to. "It wasn't a scene, Cassandra," I said, removing her hand from my arm. "It was firing an incompetent employee." She laughed, that tinkling sound that once seemed musical but now grated against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, sweetheart, you're so dramatic. Though I have to say, you might want to consider hiring someone a bit more suitable for your social standing. The help should be invisible, not embarrassing." Something about the way she said the help ignited something dark inside me. The condescension in her voice, the casual cruelty, it was like looking in a mirror and seeing the worst parts of myself reflected back. If you've ever had a moment where you realize you've become someone you don't recognize, you'll understand what happened next. Standing there, listening to Cassandra's casual dismissal of Maria's humanity, I made a decision that would change everything. A cruel, vindictive decision that I thought would teach everyone around me a lesson about judging people. "You know what, Cassandra," I said, a plan forming in my mind. "You're absolutely right. I need to hire someone more suitable." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking, Alex?" "I'm thinking," I continued, my voice taking on that dangerous edge it got when I was about to do something spectacularly stupid, "that for my next party, the one I'm throwing for the Children's Hospital fundraiser, next weekend I'm going to hire someone who will really make a statement." Cassandra clapped her hands together, delighted. "Oh, wonderful. Are you finally going to hire one of those proper English butlers? Or maybe someone from that prestigious agency in Manhattan?" "Something like that," I said, but my mind was already working on something entirely different. Something that would show all these privileged socialites exactly what I thought of their judgment and their expectations. The rest of that evening passed in a blur of champagne, meaningless conversations, and the constant background noise of people who called themselves my friends but would disappear the moment my money did. By the time the last guest left around 2 in the morning, my plan had crystallized into something beautifully vindictive. I was going to hire someone, completely unsuitable by their standards. Someone who would make Cassandra and all her society friends uncomfortable. Someone who would prove my point about their shallow judgments, while also giving me the satisfaction of watching them squirm the next morning. Nursing a champagne headache and a wounded ego, I made a decision that seemed brilliant in my twisted state of mind. I was going to drive to East Los Angeles, a world away from Beverly Hills, despite being only 20 miles and higher, a housekeeper from there. Someone who would shock my social circle. Someone who would give me the last laugh. Can you imagine how arrogant I was? How completely disconnected from reality? I actually thought I was being clever, hiring someone as a joke, as a way to prove how shallow my ex-fiancée and her friends were. I had no idea I was about to meet someone who would completely demolish every assumption I'd ever made about people, about worth, about what really mattered in life. I climbed into my matte, black Lamborghini Aventador, a car worth more than most houses, and drove through neighborhoods that might as well have been different planets. The transition from Beverly Hills to East LA isn't gradual. It's like stepping through a portal. One moment you're surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and houses that look like movie sets, and the next you're driving past chain-link fences, graffiti-covered walls, and businesses with signs in Spanish. The smell was the first thing that hit me when I rolled down my windows. A mixture of car exhaust, food, cooking somewhere, and something else I couldn't identify. Life, maybe. Real life, as opposed to the sterile perfection of my usual environment. I parked outside a small restaurant called Marisol's Kitchen, and immediately felt every eye in the area turn toward my car. A Lamborghini in East LA was like wearing a diamond tiara to a church potluck, impossible to ignore and completely out of place. Inside the restaurant, the walls were painted a warm yellow that had seen better days, and the linoleum floor showed the wear patterns of thousands of customers over the years. The air was thick with the smell of cilantro, lime, and something frying that made my stomach growl despite myself. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten food that didn't come from a five-star restaurant or a personal chef. Behind the counter stood an older woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of genuine smiles and honest work. When she looked up at me, I expected the usual reaction I got everywhere. Recognition, maybe some fawning over my wealth or status. Instead, she just looked tired. "Can I help you?" she asked in accented English, wiping her hands on a dish rag. "Looking for someone who might be interested in housework," I said, suddenly feeling ridiculous. "Cleaning, serving at a party, good pay." The woman, her name tag read Carmen, studied me with eyes that seemed to see right through my expensive clothes to something underneath. "What kind of party?" "A fundraiser, very upscale." "I need someone for one evening, maybe some prep work beforehand." Carmen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. "And you came here why?" The question caught me off guard. Why had I come here? Because I wanted to hire someone who would shock my society friends. Because I thought it would be funny to watch their faces when someone from this neighborhood walked into my mansion. Standing there under Carmen's steady gaze, those reasons suddenly seemed not just cruel but stupid. I started, then stopped. I heard this was a good place to find reliable workers. It was a lie, but Carmen seemed to accept it. She called out something in rapid Spanish toward the back of the restaurant, and a moment later, a young woman emerged from what I assumed was the kitchen. I literally felt my breath catch in my throat. She was probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and skin that held the golden undertones of someone who spent time in the sun. But it wasn't her physical beauty that stopped me cold, though she was undeniably beautiful in a completely natural, unenhanced way that made every woman in my social circle look like plastic mannequins by comparison. It was something else. The way she carried herself, the directness of her gaze when she looked at me, the complete absence of either intimidation or fawning that I was used to from people who found out who I was. "This is my daughter, Esperanza," Carmen said. "Esperanza, Marisol Vega. She works 3 jobs, but maybe she has time for something extra." Esperanza crossed her arms over her chest and looked me up and down with an expression that was anything but impressed. "What kind of work?" Her voice had just a trace of an accent, musical and warm, but there was steel underneath it. This was not a woman who would be easily impressed or easily intimidated. Housekeeping, serving, one evening, $5,000. I threw out the number, expecting shock, maybe gratitude. Instead, Esperanza's eyes narrowed suspiciously. 5,000. For one night of serving, she asked. What's the catch? Smart. I felt something that might have been respect flicker through my chest, which was unusual. Most people heard that kind of money and stopped asking questions. No catch, I lied smoothly. It's a high-end fundraiser. I need someone professional, discreet. Esperanza looked at her mother, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Finally, Carmen nodded slightly. When, Esperanza asked, "Next Saturday, you'd need to come to the house Friday afternoon for preparation." "And where, exactly? Is this house Beverly Hills?" Something flashed across her face. Not excitement or awe like I expected, but something that looked almost like recognition. Like she knew exactly what kind of world I was from and what that meant. "I'll need half the money up front," she said. "That's not how this works," I replied automatically. "That's how it works if you want me to trust someone who drives a car worth more than my family's house and offers $5,000 for one night of work to someone he's never met before." The bluntness of her response should have offended me. Instead, I found myself almost smiling. When was the last time someone had talked to me like that? Like I was just a person, not a bank account with legs. "Fair enough," I said, pulling out my wallet and counting out $2,500 bills. "Half now, half when the job is done." Esperanza took the money, but didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on my face instead. "What's your name?" "Alexandros. The casino guy," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know who I am. My brother Miguel used to work security at one of your places downtown. Said you fired him for taking a sick day to take his daughter to the hospital." The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut, mainly because I couldn't deny it. I probably had done exactly that. The faces of people I'd fired over the years blurred together in my memory, all of them just obstacles to profit and efficiency. "I run a business, not a charity," I said defensively. "No," Esperanza replied. "You run businesses. There's a difference. Have you ever had someone see right through you with just a few words? It's terrifying and oddly liberating at the same time. This woman, whose family I'd probably hurt in ways I didn't even remember, was still willing to work for me. But not because she respected me or wanted to please me. Because she needed the money, and she was practical enough to take it from someone she clearly didn't like. "So do we have a deal?" I asked. Esperanza looked at the money in her hand, then back at me. "You seem like the kind of person who thinks money solves everything. It solves most things." "No," she said quietly, "it just postpones them." She gave her mother's hand a quick squeeze and walked me to the door. Outside, the late afternoon sun was turning the sky the color of the roses in my mother's garden, a memory that hit me unexpectedly. "I'll be there Friday at 3, Esperanza said, "and Mr. Castellanos, whatever game you think you're playing, whatever point you think you're making by hiring someone like me for your fancy party, I'm not interested in being your entertainment. I'm there to work, earn my money, and leave." Standing there on that cracked sidewalk, watching this woman who had somehow seen through my entire plan without me saying a word, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty, not about business, or money, or things I could control, but about myself, about what I was doing and why. "See you Friday," I managed to say, as I drove back through the maze of freeways toward Beverly Hills. I kept thinking about her eyes. Not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because of what I'd seen in them. She looked at me like she could see everything I was trying to hide from myself, like she knew exactly who I was and found me wanting by the time I pulled into my circular driveway, past the fountain that costs more than most people's houses. I was having second thoughts about my brilliant plan, but it was too late to back out now. I'd given my word, and despite what people thought about me, I'd never broken a promise about money. That night, I stood in my master bedroom, looking out at the city lights sprawling below like a galaxy of possibilities. The bedroom was larger than most people's entire apartments, with a view that magazines called breathtaking and furniture that interior designers flew in from Italy. But for the first time in years, it felt like a prison instead of a palace. I found myself thinking about Esperanza's words. Money just postpones problems. What problems was I postponing? What was I running from with all my wealth and isolation and casual cruelty to people who couldn't fight back? The next few days passed in their usual blur of business meetings, conference calls, and the kind of meaningless social obligations that filled my calendar. But I kept thinking about Friday afternoon, about seeing Esperanza again. Part of me hoped she wouldn't show up. It would be easier that way, to go back to my original plan of hiring someone, properly vetted and appropriately grateful for the opportunity. But a larger part of me, a part I didn't want to examine too closely, was counting down the hours. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect Southern California weather that makes people move here from places where winter actually exists. I was in my study, pretending to review contracts but actually watching the driveway through the floor-to-ceiling windows, when I saw her walking up the stone path toward my front door. She was early, of course she was early. Everything about her so far suggested someone who took responsibility seriously, even when working for someone she clearly didn't respect. The doorbell rang exactly at 3 o'clock, and I found myself almost nervous as I walked across the marble foyer to answer it. When I opened the massive oak doors, Esperanza stood there looking completely unimpressed by the grandeur surrounding her. She wore simple black pants, a white button-down shirt, and shoes that had clearly seen years of hard work. But somehow, standing in the entrance to my $15 million mansion, she looked more real than anything else in my perfectly curated life. "Mr. Castellanos," she said with a slight nod. "Esperanza," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the foyer and stopped, but not in the way most people did when they first saw my home. She wasn't gawking at the crystal chandelier that costs more than a house, or the Italian marble, or the original Picasso sketch on the wall. She was looking at everything with the systematic eye of someone assessing a workspace. "Big place," she said simply. 15,000 square feet, I replied, immediately regretting how pretentious that sounded. "My whole family could live in your front hallway," she observed, but without bitterness, just as a fact. I led her through the house, showing her the kitchen, the dining room, the ballroom where tomorrow's party would be held. Throughout the tour, she asked practical questions about guest count, dietary restrictions, timeline for service. She took notes in a small notebook that looked like it had been used for everything from grocery lists to homework. It wasn't until we reached the kitchen, a space larger than most restaurants, with commercial-grade appliances and marble countertops that gleamed under pendant lights that cost more than cars, that she finally showed a reaction to us. "This is beautiful," she said softly, running her hand along the smooth surface of the island. "My mother would love this kitchen. She's been cooking in the same 10 by 10 space for 20 years. There was something in her voice, a mixture of appreciation and sadness that made me suddenly aware of how empty my beautiful kitchen usually was. When was the last time I'd actually cooked anything? When was the last time someone had prepared a meal in here with love instead of just professional obligation? "Does she cook professionally?" I asked. "She owns the restaurant where we met," Esperanza replied. "Marisol's Kitchen. She named it after me. Marisol is my middle name. She saved for 15 years to buy that place, worked 3 jobs while raising 4 kids. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt something twist in my chest. When was the last time anyone had talked about me with that kind of pride? When was the last time I'd done anything worth being proud of? "That's impressive," I said, and meant it. Spasl looked at me sharply, as if trying to detect sarcasm. When she seemed satisfied that I was being genuine, she relaxed slightly. "She's the strongest person I know," she said. "Had to be, after my father left when I was 12. There was a story there, one written in the careful way she said those words, but I didn't push. Instead, I found myself wanting to keep her talking, to hear more of that musical voice with its trace of accent and underlying steel. "How many siblings do you have?" I asked. 3. Miguel, you met him, sort of. He's 29. Then there's Sophia, she's 16 and brilliant. Gets straight A's, wants to be a doctor. And Carlos, he's 22, works construction, and you take care of all of them." Something flashed across her face, defensive, protective. "We take care of each other." But I heard what she didn't say, that she was the one working 3 jobs. That she was the one standing in my kitchen planning to serve drinks to people who wouldn't see her as human. All for money she needed for her family. As we finished the tour and went over the details for tomorrow's party, I found myself watching her more than I should have. The way she moved through my house like she belonged there, comfortable in her own skin despite being surrounded by wealth she'd never possess. The way she asked questions that showed she understood exactly what kind of event this was and what would be expected of her. The way she treated me like just another employer, instead of the celebrity that most people saw. But what really surprised me was her expertise. When we reached the ballroom, she didn't just look around admiringly like most people did. She studied the space with a critical eye. "Your bartender setup is inefficient," she said matter-of-factly. "The way you have it positioned, people will create bottlenecks trying to get drinks. If we move it to the corner and create 2 service points, flow will be much better." She was absolutely right. I'd never thought about it before. My party planners always handled those details, but looking at the space through her eyes, I could see exactly what she meant. "The lighting is too harsh for evening," she continued, studying the crystal chandeliers. "Do you have dimmers and these flowers?" She approached the elaborate arrangements the florist had delivered that morning. "They're beautiful, but they're blocking sightlines. People like to see and be seen at parties like this. If we move them to the walls and use smaller arrangements on the tables, it'll feel more intimate." With each observation, I felt a growing sense of surprise. This woman, who I'd hired as some kind of elaborate joke, clearly knew more about hosting elegant events than most professional party planners. Where had she learned this? "Have you done this kind of work before?" I asked. "I worked catering in college," she replied, already starting to rearrange the flower arrangements with an artist's eye for composition. Learned a lot about how rich people like to spend their money. There was something in her tone, not quite bitter, but not entirely neutral either. And what did you learn? She paused in her work and looked at me directly. That most of them are performing, playing characters they think they're supposed to be instead of just being themselves. The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. And you think that's what I'm doing? Performing? I think, she said carefully, moving to adjust the lighting, that you're so used to people treating you like you're different because of your money, that you've forgotten how to be a regular person. Have you ever had someone deliver a devastating truth so casually that you almost miss how profound it is? I stood there watching her transform my ballroom into something warmer and more welcoming than it had ever been. And I realized she was absolutely right. I had been performing for so long that I wasn't sure who I really was underneath the performance. Is that what you think of all wealthy people? I asked. No, she replied, climbing on a chair to adjust one of the chandeliers. I think some people let money change them, and others don't. The question is which kind you choose to be. Before I could respond, she stepped down from the chair and surveyed her work. In less than an hour, she'd transformed the space from a formal, slightly intimidating ballroom into something that actually looked inviting. The lighting was warmer, the flowers created intimate conversation areas instead of barriers, and the bar setup would indeed prevent the congestion that had plagued my previous parties. How did you learn to do that? I asked. Do what? See spaces like that? Understand how people move through them? She shrugged, but I caught a flash of something that might have been pride in her eyes. You pay attention when you spend your life in other people's spaces. Hotels, restaurants, houses where I clean. You start to notice what works and what doesn't. The casual mention of cleaning houses reminded me of the vast difference in our circumstances. She spent her days making other people's lives more comfortable, while I spent mine accumulating more wealth than I could ever use. When was the last time I'd actually made someone else's life better? We spent the next few hours working together to prepare for the party, and I found myself genuinely surprised by how much I was enjoying it. Esperanza moved through tasks with an efficiency that came from years of hard work, but she also had an eye for detail that elevated everything she touched. She didn't just polish glasses, she arranged them in patterns that caught and reflected light beautifully. She didn't just set up the serving areas, she created stations that would allow guests to flow naturally through the space. More surprising was how she talked to me, not with the deference I was used to from employees, or the calculated charm I got from social climbers, but like I was just another person. She asked my opinion on things, disagreed with me when she thought I was wrong, and treated my suggestions like they had value based on their merit rather than my bank account. Why do you work 3 jobs? I asked as we arranged the final details. She paused in her work, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Because my family needs the money, she said finally. For what? Sophia, my youngest sister, she's brilliant, gets straight A's, scored in the 99th percentile on her SATs. She wants to be a doctor, and she's smart enough to do it. But medical school costs money we don't have. What about scholarships? She'll get some, but not enough. And even with scholarships, there are living expenses, books, all the things that aren't covered. Plus my mother's restaurant is struggling. The neighborhood is changing, rent keeps going up, and she's too proud to charge enough to actually make a profit. I wanted to ask why she didn't just ask for help, but even as the thought formed, I knew how stupid it was. Ask who? People like me, who fired her brother for taking his sick daughter to the hospital. People like my social circle, who wouldn't even see her as human. And the third job? I asked. I clean houses in Westwood on weekends. Good money, and most of the families are decent to work for. Most, her expression darkened slightly. Some people think having money gives them the right to treat others like they're not worth basic respect. I thought about Maria, my former housekeeper, crying as she gathered her belongings while I shouted at her about a broken glass. I thought about how many employees I'd fired over the years for minor infractions. How I'd never once considered that they might have families, dreams, circumstances beyond my understanding. I'm sorry about your brother, I said quietly. About Miguel. I don't remember the specific situation, but I believe you when you say I fired him unfairly. Esperanza looked up at me, clearly surprised by the apology. Why are you telling me this? Because it was wrong. Because I should have said it yesterday. She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether I was being sincere. Miguel found another job, she said finally. Better pay, actually, but it was hard for a while. The guests would start arriving in 2 hours, and as I looked around the transformed ballroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Nervousness, not about the business aspects of the evening. Those were always handled efficiently by my staff, but about how my world would react to Esperanza, and more importantly, how she would react to them. Are you ready for this? I asked as she made final adjustments to the serving stations. Ready for what? For them, my guests. They can be challenging. She gave me a look that was part amusement, part steel. Mr. Castellanos, I've been dealing with difficult customers since I was 14 years old. I think I can handle a few. Rich people at a charity fundraiser. Something about the way she said it made me want to warn her more specifically. These weren't just difficult customers. These were people who would judge her before she said a word, who would see her accent and her background and immediately categorize her as less than human. People like Cassandra, who would find subtle ways to make her feel small and out of place. But looking at Esperanza's calm confidence, I realized my warnings might be more about my own anxiety than her ability to handle whatever came her way. At 6:30, I went upstairs to change into my tuxedo. It was a Tom Ford piece that had been custom made for me in London, and wearing it usually made me feel powerful, untouchable. Tonight, it just felt like another costume. When I came back downstairs, Esperanza had changed into a simple black dress that was appropriate for serving staff, but somehow looked more elegant than most of the designer gowns my guests would be. Wearing her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she'd added just enough makeup to look polished without losing any of her natural warmth. "You look professional," I said, which was a massive understatement. "That's the goal," she replied. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of nervousness that she was trying to hide. The first guests arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, because punctuality was one of the many unwritten rules of our social circle. Marcus was among them, looking characteristically elegant in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and bringing with him that air of amused detachment he wore to all social events. "Alex," he said, embracing me in the European fashion he'd never quite abandoned. "Beautiful evening. And who is this lovely lady?" He was looking at Esperanza, who had positioned herself near the entrance to take coats and direct guests to the bar. When she stepped forward to take his coat, he handed it to her with the kind of natural courtesy he showed everyone, regardless of their role. "Good evening," Esperanza said with a polite smile. "May I take your coat?" The bar is set up in the ballroom, and there are appetizers circulating. Thank you, Marcus replied, then turned to me with raised eyebrows. New staff. Just for tonight, I said, watching as more guests arrived, and Esperanza handled each interaction with the same professional warmth. What happened next was something I hadn't anticipated. Instead of being intimidated by my guests or fading into the background as service staff usually did, Esperanza somehow managed to become a subtle presence that enhanced the entire evening. She moved through the room with natural grace, appearing at exactly the right moments with drinks or appetizers, remembering people's preferences after hearing them once, and somehow making each guest feel attended to without being intrusive. But it was more than just good service. There was something about her that made people notice her, want to talk to her. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, completely comfortable in her own skin despite being surrounded by wealth and status she'd never possess. Maybe it was her genuine warmth, so different from the calculated charm most of my guests were used to. Or maybe it was simply that she treated everyone like they were human beings worthy of respect, regardless of their bank account or social position. Cassandra arrived fashionably late, as always, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars and accompanied by her new boyfriend, a tech entrepreneur named Bradley who talked too loudly and laughed too much at his own jokes. I watched from across the room as Esperanza approached to offer them drinks. Champagne for the lady, and what can I get for you, sir? Esperanza asked Bradley with professional courtesy. Scotch, neat. The good stuff, Bradley replied without really looking at her. And make it a double. I saw something flicker across Esperanza's face. Not offense exactly, but a moment of assessment. She'd just been categorized as invisible, and she knew it. Of course, she said smoothly. We have Macallan, 25. Or, if you prefer something even more special, there's a bottle of Glenfiddich 40 that Mr. Castellanos keeps for particular occasions. Bradley's head snapped up, suddenly paying attention. You know whiskey. My grandfather was Scottish, Esperanza replied with a slight smile. He taught me to appreciate good whiskey before I was old enough to legally drink it. It was probably a lie, but it was a brilliant one. Bradley's entire demeanor changed as he found himself actually seeing her as a person rather than just service staff. Really, what did he drink? Lagavulin, 16, mostly. Said anything older was just showing off. Bradley laughed, a genuine sound this time rather than his usual forced chuckle. Smart man, I'll take the Macallan and thank you for the recommendation. As Esperanza moved away to get his drink, I realized what I'd just witnessed. She hadn't been intimidated or offended by his initial dismissal. Instead, she'd found a way to make him see her as a real person, someone worth treating with respect. It was a masterclass in human psychology, delivered with such subtle skill that Bradley probably didn't even realize what had happened. Who is that server? Cassandra asked, appearing at my elbow with her champagne flute. She seems ... different. Different how? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. She doesn't act like the help usually does. She's almost confident. There was something in Cassandra's tone that I didn't like. A note of suspicion, like Esperanza's confidence, was somehow inappropriate for someone in her position. Throughout the evening, I found myself watching Esperanza more than I should have. The way she handled my guests was nothing short of remarkable. When Senator Morrison's wife started complaining loudly about the wine selection, Esperanza quietly appeared with a bottle of the woman's favorite vintage, somehow having deduced her preference from overheard conversation. When the mayor's husband began pontificating about art to anyone who would listen, Esperanza managed to be nearby with fresh drinks, just as people were looking for excuses to escape his monologue. But what impressed me most was how she handled the inevitable condescension, because despite her skill and professionalism, some of my guests still treated her like she was invisible, or worse, like she was there for their entertainment. Mrs. Vanderberg, the wife of a real estate mogul, actually snapped her fingers to get Esperanza's attention. Another guest, a hedge fund manager named Peterson, made a comment about authentic ethnic help that made my blood boil. Each time, Esperanza handled it with grace that made the offending guest look small by comparison. She never lost her composure, never showed offense, but somehow managed to make it clear that their behavior was beneath her notice. It was around 9 o'clock when something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the evening. I was talking with a group of investors about a potential expansion into the Asian market when I heard Cassandra's voice rise above the general conversation. "Well, I think it's wonderful that you're so dedicated to your family," she was saying, but her tone made it clear the sentiment was anything but genuine. "It must be difficult, working so many jobs just to get by." I turned to see Cassandra and several other guests surrounding Esperanza near the bar. There was something predatory in their posture, like sharks who had smelled blood in the water. "3 jobs," Peterson added with that smug smile he wore whenever he thought he was being clever. "That's admirable. Very ... industrious. What kind of work do you do when you're not serving drinks?" asked Mrs. Vanderberg, her voice dripping with false concern. I could see what was happening. They'd figured out that Esperanza wasn't from their world, and now they were circling like vultures, ready to pick apart her background for their own amusement. It was the kind of casual cruelty that my social circle specialized in. The way they maintained their sense of superiority by reminding others of their place. But if they expected Esperanza to be embarrassed or intimidated, they had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. "I work at my mother's restaurant," she said calmly, "and I also do residential cleaning on weekends. It's honest work, and it pays well enough to help my sister through school." "How nice," Cassandra purred. "And what is your sister studying, Prima?" "At UCLA, Esperanza replied without a trace of defensiveness. "She wants to be a cardiac surgeon." There was a moment of silence as this information sank in. A scholarship kid from East LA planning to become a cardiac surgeon was not the narrative they'd expected. "UCLA has an excellent medical program," said Dr. Richardson, one of the few guests who actually worked for a living instead of just inherited. "Money, very competitive." "Sophia is very competitive," Esperanza replied with obvious pride. "She's never gotten anything less than an A in her life." "How wonderful," Mrs. Vanderberg said, but her tone suggested she found it anything but wonderful. "And I suppose you're all very close, very ... family-oriented." The way she said family-oriented made it sound like some kind of ethnic stereotype, and I saw Esperanza's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said simply. "We believe in taking care of each other." "How traditional," Cassandra added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It must be such a different world from ... this." She gestured around the ballroom as if to emphasize the vast distance between Esperanza's life and theirs. That's when Esperanza did something that completely floored me. Instead of being intimidated or defensive, she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that somehow made Cassandra's artificial one look cheap by comparison. "It is different," she agreed. "In my world, We judge people by their character and their actions, not by their bank account or their family name. It's a much simpler way to live. The silence that followed was deafening. With one quiet sentence, she'd managed to turn their attack back on them, pointing out the shallow values of their entire social system without ever raising her voice or losing her composure. "How refreshing," Marcus said, appearing at the edge of the group with that slight smile he wore when he was enjoying someone else's discomfort. "Such an honest perspective." Dr. Richardson nodded approvingly. "It's a good philosophy. I wish more people lived by it." I watched as the group began to disperse, the wind taken out of their sails by Esperanza's refusal to be humiliated. Cassandra looked particularly frustrated, clearly having expected a very different outcome from her little ambush. As the evening continued, I noticed a shift in how the guests treated Esperanza. Word had apparently spread about her sister at UCLA and her unshakable composure under pressure. Several people made a point of actually conversing with her rather than just ordering drinks. Dr. Richardson spent 10 minutes discussing medical schools with her. Even Peterson, who had started the evening treating her like furniture, asked her opinion on a wine selection. Can you imagine how it felt to watch someone you'd hired as a joke completely transform your social gathering just by being herself? Every assumption I'd made about how the evening would go had been wrong. I'd expected Esperanza to be intimidated, maybe even humiliated, by my social circle. Instead, she'd shown them up without even trying. By 11 o'clock, as the last guests were beginning to leave, I realized the evening had been one of the most successful parties I'd ever hosted. Not because of the fundraising, though we'd raised a substantial amount for the Children's Hospital, but because, for the first time in years, people had actually seemed to enjoy themselves. The conversations had been more genuine, the atmosphere warmer, the entire event more human somehow, and it was all because of her. After the last guest left, I helped Esperanza clean up, though she protested that it wasn't necessary. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, restoring my ballroom to its usual pristine state. "That was impressive," I said as we finished stacking the last of the glasses. "What was the way you handled them? Especially Cassandra and her friends." Esperanza shrugged. "I've dealt with worse. Still, they were trying to embarrass you, and you turned it around on them." She paused in her work and looked at me directly. "Were you expecting me to be embarrassed?" The question caught me off guard, because it was so direct, so honest. I don't know what I was expecting." "Yes, you do," she said quietly. "You hired me because you thought I'd be out of place here. You thought your friends would look down on me, and you thought that would prove some kind of point about how shallow they are." I felt my face flush because she was absolutely right. "How did you know?" "Because people like you always think money makes you smarter than people like me. You think we don't notice things, don't understand the games you play," she finished, wiping down the bar and turned to face me fully. "But here's what you didn't expect. I don't need your money or your approval to know who I am." Standing there in my ballroom, surrounded by all the trappings of my wealth and privilege, I felt smaller than I had in years. This woman, who had every reason to hate me for the way I'd treated her brother and my casual cruelty to people in her position, had just delivered the most devastating and accurate assessment of my character I'd ever heard. "You're right," I said quietly. "That's exactly what I was doing." "I know," she replied, but without anger. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before I could answer, she gathered her things and headed toward the door. But instead of leaving immediately, she paused in the foyer, looking at something on the wall that had caught her attention. It was a series of framed photographs, family pictures from my childhood, back when my parents were alive and our house felt like a home instead of a museum. There was one of me at maybe 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while my mother hugged me close. Another of my father teaching me to throw a football in our backyard. A third of all three of us at Disneyland, looking like any normal family having a day of fun. "You look happy here," Esperanza said softly, studying the pictures. I replied, joining her in front of the photographs. "That was a long time ago. What happened?" Such a simple question, but it opened something in my chest that I'd kept locked away for years. "They died 3 years ago. Helicopter crash in Monaco." "I'm sorry," she said, and I could tell she meant it. After that, everything changed. I changed. I looked at that little boy in the pictures, so full of joy and possibility, and wondered when he'd disappeared. I think I forgot how to be happy. Esperanza was quiet for a long moment, still looking at the photographs. "They look like good parents." "The best," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "They would have hated what I've become." She turned to look at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. Not pity, not judgment, but understanding. Like she recognized the pain behind my anger and isolation. "It's not too late to remember," she said quietly, and then she was gone, leaving me standing alone in my empty mansion, surrounded by all my beautiful, meaningless things. Thinking about a little boy who used to know how to smile. Those words echoed in my mind for days. I couldn't stop thinking about her, not just her beauty, but her strength, her dignity, the way she'd seen right through all my defenses to something I'd forgotten existed. It's not too late to remember. Have you ever felt like someone handed you a mirror and for the first time in years, you saw yourself clearly? That's what Esperanza had done. She'd shown me not just who I'd become, but who I used to be. That little boy in the photographs, the one who smiled without calculating the cost, who loved without wondering what he'd get in return. A week passed, and I couldn't concentrate on anything. Business meetings felt meaningless. The acquisition deal I'd been working on for months suddenly seemed like a pointless way to accumulate more money I didn't need. I kept finding myself staring at those childhood photographs, remembering what it felt like to be genuinely happy. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and I couldn't go back to pretending that my empty, cruel existence was enough. I had to see her again. But this time, I didn't take the Lamborghini. Instead, I found my father's old pickup truck in the garage. A beat-up Ford F-150 that he'd refused to get rid of even after we became wealthy. A man should never forget where he came from, he used to say. I'd forgotten that lesson, along with so many others. Driving through East LA in the pickup felt different than it had in the Lamborghini. People didn't stare. I didn't feel like an alien visiting a foreign planet. I felt like just another person trying to find his way. I found Esperanza at her mother's restaurant during the lunch rush, working behind the counter with the same efficiency she'd shown at my party. When she saw me walk through the door, she looked surprised but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Castellano," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," I said, "and to ask you something." Carmen looked between us with knowing eyes, said something to Esperanza in rapid Spanish, and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving us alone at the counter. "Apologize for what?" Esperanza asked, but I could see she already knew. For hiring you. As a joke. For thinking I was better than you. For all the ways I've hurt people like your family over the years. I took a deep breath, trying to find the courage for the real reason I'd come. And I came to ask if you'd have dinner with me. Not as an employer and employee, but as ... equals. She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her weighing my words, trying to decide if I was sincere. Why? Because you showed me who I used to be, who I could be again. Because in one evening, you made me feel more human than I have in 3 years. And what makes you think I'd want to have dinner with someone who fired my brother for taking care of his sick daughter? Nothing, I admitted, except hope that you might give me a chance to be different. She was quiet for so long, I thought. She'd refuse. People in the restaurant continued eating, the sounds of conversation and clinking dishes filling the silence between us. Finally, she spoke. There's a condition, anything. You make things right with Miguel first, and you change how you treat people who work for you. All of them, done. She looked surprised by how quickly I agreed. Just like that, just like that. You're right about everything, Esperanza. I've been a terrible person, and I want to be better. I want to be someone my parents would be proud of again. Something in my voice must have convinced her, because her expression softened slightly. There's a place in my neighborhood that makes the best tacos you've ever had. It's not fancy. I don't want fancy, I said. I want real. The dinner was the beginning of everything. Not just a relationship, but a complete transformation of who I was. Esperanza didn't just challenge me to be better, she showed me how. She introduced me to her world, her family, her values. Through her eyes, I learned to see people as human beings rather than obstacles or opportunities. The first thing I did was find Miguel. It turned out he was working security at a construction site, making barely half what I'd paid him. When I showed up to apologize, he was suspicious at first. Who could blame him? But when I offered him a management position at double his previous salary, along with healthcare and college tuition assistance for his daughter, he started to believe. I was serious about changing. Why? He asked. Why now? Because your sister taught me something about dignity, I said. About what really matters. Miguel became my right-hand man in transforming how we treated employees across all my businesses. We instituted fair wages, comprehensive benefits, and most importantly, a culture of respect. I started learning employees' names, asking about their families, treating them like the valuable human beings they were instead of just cogs in a machine. But the real transformation was personal. Through Esperanza, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd thought were gone forever. She taught me to find joy in simple things, cooking dinner together in my enormous kitchen, watching the sunset from my terrace, laughing until my sides hurt at her stories about her family. She introduced me to her world gradually, first to Sophia, the brilliant 16-year-old with dreams of becoming a cardiac surgeon, then to Carlos, the construction worker with an artist's soul who painted beautiful murals in his spare time. Each member of her family welcomed me with a warmth I hadn't experienced since my parents died. Sunday dinners at Carmen's restaurant became sacred to me. Sitting around a crowded table, listening to conversations in both English and Spanish, feeling like part of something real and meaningful. It was everything my expensive Beverly Hills parties had never been. You're different, Marcus observed one evening when we met for drinks. Happier. I'm remembering who I used to be, I told him. It's her, isn't it? The woman from the party. I nodded. She saved me, Marcus, from myself. 6 months after that first dinner, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Esperanza, but I also knew that a traditional proposal wouldn't mean anything to her. She wasn't impressed by grand gestures or expensive rings. She valued authenticity, family, love that was demonstrated through actions rather than words. So, I proposed to her in the place where we'd first met, in her mother's restaurant, surrounded by her family and the community that had taught me what real wealth looked like. I got down on one knee next to the same table where her mother had first told me about her daughter, holding not some enormous diamond that cost more than a house, but my grandmother's simple gold band, the one she'd worn for 60 years of marriage to my grandfather. Esperanza Marisol Vega, I said, my voice shaking with nerves. Will you marry me? Not because of what I have, but because of who you've helped me become. The entire restaurant went silent. Carmen had tears in her eyes. Sophia was recording everything on her phone. Carlos looked ready to tackle me if I hurt his sister. And Esperanza, beautiful, strong, incredible Esperanza, looked at me with those eyes that had seen through all my defenses from the very beginning. Yes, she said simply, but only if you promise to keep becoming the man you're meant to be. Our wedding was nothing like the ostentatious affairs I'd attended in my previous life. We held it in the garden behind Marisol's kitchen with string lights and homemade decorations and food prepared by Carmen herself. Marcus was my best man, and he admitted later he'd never seen me so genuinely happy. Most of my former social circle didn't attend. They couldn't understand how I could choose love over status. But their absence felt like freedom rather than loss. Dr. Richardson came, along with several other guests from that fateful party who had been impressed by Esperanza's grace and dignity. But the majority of our guests were from her world teachers, and construction workers and restaurant employees and medical students, people who knew the value of hard work and genuine love. As I stood there, watching Esperanza walk down the aisle in a simple white dress that cost less than my tuxedo shoes, I thought about that broken crystal glass that had started this entire journey, how my rage over something so meaningless had led me to make a decision that changed everything, how trying to humiliate someone else had ended up showing me exactly how lost I'd become now. 5 years later, I wake up every morning in a house that's finally a home. The marble floors echo with laughter instead of loneliness. The kitchen that once stood empty is filled with the sounds and smells of family dinners and holiday celebrations. Esperanza still works. She runs a non-profit now that provides scholarships for students from underprivileged backgrounds. Sophia did become a doctor, graduating summa cum laude from medical school and now completing her residency in cardiac surgery. Carlos owns his own construction company and has painted murals throughout East LA that tell the stories of the community. Miguel manages several of my businesses and has instituted employee welfare programs that other companies now try to emulate. And Carmen, her restaurant is thriving, with 3 locations now, including one in Beverly Hills that serves the best authentic Mexican food in the city to clients who appreciate real quality over pretentious presentation. As for me, I still run my businesses, but they're different now. We're known for treating employees like family, for giving back to communities, for using wealth to lift others up rather than keep them down. The profits are still substantial, but the real reward is knowing we're making a positive difference in people's lives. If you've ever wondered whether people can really change, whether love can transform someone completely, I'm living proof that it can. The Greek god everyone used to know, arrogant, cruel, isolated, died the night Esperanza Marisol Vega walked into my ballroom and showed me what real strength looked like. The man I am now, the husband and father and friend I've become, was born the moment she looked at those childhood photographs and said, "It's not too late to remember." And you know what? She was absolutely right. It's never too late to remember who you're supposed to be, especially when you find someone who loves you enough to help you become that person. That broken crystal glass that started this whole story. I keep the pieces in a frame on my desk now, next to a picture of Esperanza and me on our wedding day. It's a reminder of how easily we can shatter things that matter, and how much more valuable it is to build something beautiful instead. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming someone worthy of the love you thought you'd never deserve. And sometimes, if you're incredibly lucky, the person you hire to prove a point about shallow people ends up proving the most important point of all. That love, real love, can save even the most lost soul. If you liked this story, please hit that like button. If you believe that people can change, that love really can transform us, please subscribe for more stories about second chances and finding what really matters. And leave a comment below. Have you ever had someone come into your life and completely change who you are? I'd love to hear your stories, because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to figure out how to be better, how to love better, how to matter in this world. And sometimes, it takes someone from a completely different world to show us who we really are underneath all our fears and defenses and pretenses. Esperanza Marisol Vega saved Alexandra's Dimitru Castellanos. But more than that, she taught him that being rich in love, family, and purpose is the only wealth that really matters. And that's a lesson worth more than all the money in the world.